Hi, everyone. Hi again to those who were here for the earlier talk and caught the discussion with Minerva Cuevas. My name is Aska Hisa. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement. Hello. Witch hunt. This is a wicked... This is a wicked good exhibition. And it's existing between two institutions, the Institute of Contemporary Art Los Angeles and the Hammer Museum. And the show features 16 critically acclaimed international artists who employ feminist, queer, and decolonial strategies to explore gender, power, and the global impacts of systemic patriarchy. The project was conceived and organized by two of our most admired curators, Anne Ellegood, who is the Good Works Executive Director at ICALA, and Connie Butler, Chief Curator at the Hammer Museum, as well as Nika Chilwich, Curatorial Assistant at the Hammer, who provided an important voice and vision for the project. So on site here at ICALA are 5 projects by Candice Breitz, Minerva Cuevas, Vaginal Davis, Every Ocean Hughes, and Lara Schnitger. And we encourage you, of course, to go make your appointment to visit the Hammer to see the 10 other projects by Leonora Tunes, Yael Bartana, Pauline Boudry and Renate Lorenz, Shulei Chang, Bushra Khalili, Laura Lima, Teresa Margoyes, Otobong Nikanga, Okwui Okpokwasili, and Beverly Sims. So to take advantage of the fact that we had the international artists in town, having traveled here with no shortage of pandemic challenges, we decided to begin with a bang of back-to-back programs here. So to maximize our time together, because we want to go back to celebrating also, we have provided extended bio sheets on your seats. The program is titled The Act of Memorializing, so I think you can figure out what we're going to focus on. And it features Candice, Every, and Okwui, moderated by Anne and Connie. So very quickly, Candice Breitz is a Berlin-based artist who originally hails from Johannesburg. Her photography and moving image installations have been shown internationally. Every Ocean Hughes, formerly known as Emily Royston, is a transdisciplinary artist and writer currently based between the US and Stockholm. Her recent projects take the form of performance, photographic installations, printmaking, text, video, and curating. Okwui Okpokwasili is New York-born, Brooklyn-based writer, performer, and choreographer who works across performance disciplines and genres. So some final simple notes. We have a beautiful catalog right there. There's a stack of them. They're available for purchase. To visit ICALA and the Hammer, you will need to make an appointment. Our hours are Wednesday through Sunday, and we require masks at all times. We have exciting public programs for you at both institutions, online and on-site, and we don't want you to miss them, so please consider following us on social media or joining our mailing list. And I think you can join our mailing list right at the front desk. So thank you for coming. We are recording this program. We will have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but not a ton. So think about your questions. And let's begin. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Aska. Hi, everyone. I'm Anne Ellegood. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and Connie might say a few words as well. Then we're going to do 5 minutes with each artist briefly so they can introduce the work in the exhibition. And then we'll go into really a conversation to talk about memorializing, memorials, and just their work in general. So honored to be up here with you 3 and my amazing co-curators. This is a tour de force up here, and it's really an honor. So Connie and I first started talking about doing a show. Oh, by the way I'm leaning in, please do that because we're recording, and if you sit too far back, it doesn't get recorded. So Connie and I first started talking about doing a show that focuses on current feminist practices after the 2016 election, at a moment when such an overt misogynist was brought into power, and when the conservative right was also wielding power in a number of countries throughout the world, And also as curators who had long been committed to feminist discourses throughout our careers, we asked ourselves, what does feminism even mean today? Today there's a new president in the White House, but we continue to witness alarming erosions to the rights of women and non-binary folks. Just the past 2 weeks have yielded egregious restrictions to reproductive rights, and yet another strong indication that the current Supreme Court does not believe women are truly equal citizens or fully adult humans with dignity, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg so beautifully called for so many years ago. As we began to think about co-curating an exhibition, we quickly gravitated toward the idea of presenting the work of a smallish group of mid-career artists. We felt it was important that the exhibition include an international roster of artists to reflect a diversity of practices and subject matters, and we wanted to be able to include a major project by all artists included. Witch Hunt includes recent projects and many new commissions that were made specifically for the exhibition, which is just wonderful, by 16 mid-career women artists from 13 different countries. The artists represented in Witch Hunt have demonstrated decades-long commitments to a multiplicity of feminist approaches to art making, critical, expansive, and oftentimes collaborative, as you'll hear today. By giving voice to diverse aspects of international thought and action, their works illuminate some of the most urgent challenges we face as a global community. Importantly, as Oscar just said, Witch Hunt is a single exhibition in 2 locations, here at ICA LA and at the Hammer. So if you haven't already gone to the Hammer Museum, I encourage you to do so. There are 10 remarkable projects there on view. A few words about our title, Witch Hunt. People are curious about the title, intrigued, I think. Sometimes I admit that we were using it a little bit as a joke, and then obviously it stuck. And I think it stuck for good reason. The term witch hunt is often invoked today in the rhetoric of powerful public figures, usually men, who are threatened with the loss of their status and privilege. But the term witch hunt is, of course, inextricably linked to women's history. The claim of victimhood by individuals today, often politicians, is also deeply ironic, given that witch hunts have historically been inflicted upon the marginalized by the powerful, not the other way around, most notoriously to oppress women. The exhibition seeks to refocus public attention on the ways in which those who are perceived as disrupting the status quo, who demand equality, visibility, and access to power, continue to be persecuted in our culture and many others. Witch Hunt also celebrates powerful women and feminisms, in the plural, through the work of artists whose practices persistently advocate for a future that embraces complex subjectivities and experiences. Connie and I are really looking forward to this conversation today with these 3 artists. Okwi's work is at the Hammer, so you can see Candice and Every's, if you haven't already, after the panel. They are both video works that will be turned on to their full glory, so please stick around and see those, and then please visit the Hammer to see Okwi's. We have so much respect and admiration for their work, and we're really grateful to have this opportunity to hear from them directly. Want to add anything?
No, just to say thank you. Okwui and I have just come from across town, so I feel filled with already the power of her performance and history and memorial, actually, as well. So I think we should just dive right in. Thanks.
Great. Candice, you're up.
Hey. So let's see, am I hitting this in the right spot? The first thing, gotta hit the spot. The first thing I'd like to say is just a very big thank you, both to the 3 of you for guiding us on this journey, but also to all of the other artists. It's very rarely that I am this excited about being in a group show lineup, and to have the work showcase along so many artists whose work I've just loved and respected and admired is truly a treat. In the context of this panel specifically, I'm going to try and stay on topic. My piece is very layered, and I find it hard to sort of squish it down into 5 minutes, because it really is a piece which I guess its title implies, that seeks to acknowledge the ways in which information and experience is lost when we try to take shortcuts and when we try to put things in a nutshell, things that can't be easily squeezed into a nutshell. The title of the piece is TLDR, and relative to the topic of our panel today, I would say that there are two forms of memorialization which I hope are held by the piece. On the first hand, I should mention actually that my collaborators, the performers in this piece, belong to an incredibly fierce collective of sex workers and sex work activists who are based in Cape Town, South Africa. This is a very organized community which has been doing incredible work to create awareness around sex work, mainly and primarily to try and decriminalize and destigmatize sex work, helping sex workers to understand what their rights are in relation to the law, to stay healthy, to figure out how to create infrastructures whereby their income reaches their children's school fees or whatever the case may be. So this is a community which pre-exists me and which I only felt I could engage with because there was that degree of organization and existing activist awareness among the individuals who participate in the piece. The piece was generated by a very specific and very brutal incident. In 2013, a very young woman named Nokuphila Khumalo was murdered in cold blood, very, very brutally, on the streets of Cape Town by one of our best-known artists, whose name is Zwelethu Mthethwa. And it happened in a strange place. It happened in a neighborhood called Woodstock, which happens to be a neighborhood in which sex work and artwork coalesce. Like so many art neighborhoods, it's a gentrifying neighborhood that has been and remains a space of labor for sex workers. And this kind of coalescing of these two communities, I suppose, was what created the conditions under which this very young woman, Nokuphila, who was a sex worker, met an early and very ugly death at the hands of the man who murdered her. And I met this community in protest. We came together because the South African National Gallery in Cape Town decided to put together an exhibition at the time that Mthethwa was on trial for the murder of Nokuphila Khumalo, and it was an exhibition which focused on re-examining gender and trying to break open some of the heteronormative gender principles which have, of course, very much underwritten the collecting and the exhibiting of the South African National Gallery, as would be the case elsewhere in the world too, of course. Anyway, this was an exhibition that was designed to question and interrogate gender, and yet 20 of the 25 artists on the exhibition were male identified. 19 of the artists were white men. There was a single black man, a single black artist who was male identified in the exhibition, and that was this individual, Zwelethu Mthethwa, who was at that moment at trial. So there were a few constituencies who found that fully unacceptable, and I'm not using the word few facetiously. There were really very few of us who thought that this was something that was unacceptable, and the two constituencies which came forward and in protest were SWEAT, the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force. That is the collective name for this community of people who you will meet when you experience the piece. They really led the protests, and they were vehement and present on the stairs of the South African National Gallery every day, trying to get the work taken down, trying to create awareness around the death of their colleague. I should mention, and this may be obvious to many of you, that unfortunately this death was not an isolated death. Hundreds of sex workers get murdered in South Africa every year and in many countries every year. And because their labor is criminalized and stigmatized, they have no legal recourse, they have no labor rights. They essentially are an invisible community. And that's where I come maybe back to the point, which is that I think that through this situation of protesting together and coming serendipitously into contact around things that we cared about and had in common, we fell into friendship and we fell into conversation. And we started to talk about our relative skills and abilities. So the Sweat community is full of very skilled activists, people with incredible lived experience, complex stories to share. And what I bring to the table, I think, is an ability to tell stories, an interest in listening to stories, the possibility of framing those stories and perhaps bringing them into a little bit of visibility. So what I offered to that community at the beginning was very simple. It was incredibly obvious, had been for a long time, that to be a sex worker in South Africa and many other similar economies and geographical contexts is to be invisibilized, it's to be unseen, it's to be unregarded, it's to be seen as non-human and not worthy of the small and large attentions that every human being should have access to. And so I offered the Sweat community an archive. That was a very simple idea, and at the beginning I really wasn't thinking of it as an art gesture or as my art practice. I simply thought that it might be valuable to collect some of the stories and some of the biographies of the individuals who I was spending more and more time with, getting to know, getting to share strategies and ideas with. And so I asked the Sweat community they liked the idea very much, because typically when they're interviewed or when they have any kind of attention, typically it's a sound bite in the television news, and it's always salacious and focused on their bodies and seldom kind of regards them in a round way. So that archive is what you will find in the first room of the installation. The Sweat community spoke amongst themselves and elected 10 individuals from the community who liked the idea of being interviewed, sharing their stories, having their anecdotes and memories and reflections and strategies as activists and as sex workers be captured for an archive. And once we had finished working through those interviews, I kind of felt like my role was over. I think it should be obvious to most people in this room that this is a potentially very fraught situation, a very privileged white woman stepping into a largely black space of intense precarity, and certainly being very aware of the many ways in which I could have done more damage than good within that space, within that context. I think that in that sense, I think of this piece as a memorial, a future memorial to a community of people who might otherwise not have been remembered in ways that were accessible. These are people who are, of course, valuable and precious to those around them, but who are not granted a broader visibility. More specifically, and in a dialogue with Sweat, we were interested collectively in building a monument to Nokupila, a 22-year-old woman who elected to sell sexual services because she had 3 young children as a result of the long-lasting legacy of apartheid. She's not someone who had access to training or formal education or any kind of learning of skills, and somebody who could very easily have gone absolutely unremembered, fallen through the cracks, as so many people do when they live on the margins of proper society, or society that sees itself or frames itself as proper. So maybe that's enough. I'm sort of conscious of how much we have to squeeze into this panel, but I think in both of those senses, the work is an attempt to create a space of memory for Nokupila and the many, many others who have met similarly devastating fates, and also a hope that it might be possible to create open up a space in which others will listen to and spend time with the stories of the community at large.
Thank you, Candice. Avery, do you want to play the audio first?
Yeah, I'll manage that one.
Do you need me to? Do you need me to use?
I'll do it. Thank you. Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. My name is Avery.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. It's been years. And I'll echo all of the thanks that we're going to hear around for this spectacular show and group of artists and all of the work that's been done to bring us together. Nice to be with you. Hi.
I meant you and me, I meant you, help the dead, help me, help the dead. I commit to you, help the dead, help me, help the dead. I commit to you.
I was going to sing that, but I thought they did it so much better. Those are the voices of Gio Wyeth and Colin Self. The work I have in the gallery over here is called One Big Bag. The first, it's the second part in a 3-part series. The first was Help the Dead, that Gio and Colin performed pre-pandemic. So maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I started studying how to do death work. It comes from personal experience. It was a emotional and spiritual interest, and devised of, personal experience. I had the honor to help my beloved sister, mother, grandmother die, and was reflecting on previous experiences of grief in my life, and decided to really develop skills around it. I had for many years wanted to have be of service outside of my life as an artist. And when I was younger, I used to say that I had use value issues. I thought I should be useful. And then I started doing this stuff, and we all wonder about that all the time, those intersections of our practices and our politics and what we're producing. So I was in a time of life thinking about being of service, and I thought this was something that I could do, actually, was look at death, which is something that many of us turn away from for mostly, that we, I don't even have to explain that, it's just, it's the way it is. So I started to turn towards it and to really gain skills. I realized that I had been grown up going to hospice houses, and then I started to learn first and foremost from my 2 mothers and my grandmother. The 3 of them had raised me. So first I learned there, and then I started to study. And so Help the Dead I think of as like a kind of social project. One Big Bag is like really more focused on the materiality, and the one that will be coming in the coming year is in the mytho-historical realm. So I want to just start again. Those voices you heard were from Help the Dead, and then I offer this quote also from that script. On this spectrum of alive and dead, dead is not the opposite of alive. It's not a binary or a simple biological fact. It's a complex social choice. What is dead? What do we let die? Who do we let die? Who do we actively harm? What do we actively extinguish? So in thinking about death and thus all elements of memorialization, loss, and grief, I really wanted to simultaneously hold these things in the realm of the most intimate. It is one of the foundational things of being human. It's okay, it's a good song. And then also the way that we experience death in the public realm. So for many years we're reading about all kinds of violence and police caused deaths and war and economic crisis, environmental catastrophes, and these kinds of deaths. Of course the death of your loved one, but also those. I want to keep those always in relationship to each other. So that's the work that then comes here. This one really does focus on this materiality. I'm not sure if you've seen it yet, but she really, we're talking about the body, we're talking about the objects that a death doula uses to care for someone who is dying or a new corpse. And my, I guess one of the points there is to really think about offering a kind of a set of tools. My interest largely is in like self-determination and mutual aid, in being able to be very concrete about what our bodies are, about what happens around this time of dying and death, and in doing so, really giving people the opportunity to contemplate, prepare for, question how they would like the end of their lives to be. This is, in one way, a privileged question. Many and most, absolutely most of us, do not have that choice. But I'm interested in doing like that kind of pre-thought, and also having that question exist within communities and families and self-chosen families, that we are prepared in this way of self-determination and mutual aid to meet each other when we are not well and when we are declining. There's a quote in the film, it's so interesting how each of us decline. So those are some of the questions. In prior work, I had been thinking about the series I did before, maybe lasted about 5 years, called the Uncounted series, but thinking about a lifetime, the politics of performance, and this question, what is a transition that is not a solution? And in looking at, and then that was like, in some ways, a choreographic question. It's a little bit more abstract, but when we turn those questions of a lifetime and transitions and look at death work, then I can just say that I was trying to rub those things up alongside of each other. I also want to acknowledge this extraordinary performer, Lindsay Rico, who is an East LA native. So let me see, I have my 5 minutes. I also just will say one more thing, which is one of the kind of formal elements of the video is to really think about the liveness in relationship to this work. So if you just maybe hold that in mind, and we can discuss that later, but that was one of the kind of tensions that I was trying to work with more formally and as an art project. Because the work, I think of it as having kind of a verse-chorus structure, in which there is the very practical kind of skill share. Like, this is a pair of scissors, this is a kind of glue, this is what we use the glue for when we have a corpse and we have to wash the body. Very practical. And then on the other hand, the expository, which is emotion, which is humor, which is trauma. So it's kind of going back and forth. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, wow, I'm super honored to be sitting here with you guys. Excuse me. I had some nose work to do. Thank you, Connie, Anne, Nika, Candice, sorry. So my piece is, sort of began in 2014, right around the time that the protests around Michael Brown were happening in Missouri, because his dead body was laid out on the street as well after being shot unarmed by a police officer. It was also the year that the Chibok schoolgirls in northern Nigeria were stolen, and all of these women came together to protest and become visible and loudly make sure that the government was doing something to find them. It was also the year that George Zimmerman was going to be going on trial for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And I started to think about how protests movements led by women have driven progress and change globally. And the Bring Back Our Girls movement that was happening was really exciting to me, because I thought, okay, there's all of this attention being paid to these missing Nigerian girls, but I also felt it was eliding the role of the Nigerian women who were bringing it to attention. And I was just also really interested in how these global women's movements, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there are women who have been incredibly active in fighting for their liberation, fighting to be seen. Their presence has been erased, right? They're often thought of as, victims or folks who need United Nations help. So I just kind of, as somebody who was born and raised in the US of Nigerian parents, I really wanted to start to, in some way, excavate or find them. And it's directly linked to perhaps how I exist or where I exist as someone who is in a liminal space, right? Both a child of a colonial sort of missionary project that sort of breaks the link of the traditions and practices of people of indigenous people within the country, but also living the effects of being a Black African American woman in this country. And I just was really exploring, or interested in exploring, what those linkages are, what that space is. So I found these commissioned reports. Because there was a woman's war, the British called it a woman's riot in 1929, where these women in Southeast Nigeria came together and they were pissed and they didn't want to be taxed, they wanted to be heard, they were fighting against the corruption of colonial representatives, and they proceeded to go on a 3-month kind of protest, destroying missionary outposts. I believe over 50 of them were killed, shot down by British forces, and like good Europeans, regardless of what they call themselves, they commissioned reports to find out, well, what happened? Why are these women behaving like this? What drove them to make us shoot them? So I'm sure, that's just, I'm sure that's what it was. That's not a direct quote. So I proceeded to sort of read these commissioned reports, and I started to extract language and build a song. Because in a way, my practices often involve duration. They involve how do you stay in one place, how do you shift an art experience from being one of transaction to one of transmission. So I devised a song inspired by these women, but also taking language from these commissioned reports that was an hour long, and I sang it straight. I used to have a spit bucket because the rhythm was such that I couldn't swallow. Anyway, and so the piece itself, I used to perform in the piece, but because of COVID, and we had been trying to contend with what might happen if we want to have the piece and I'm not in it, and we started to sort of devise ways to have a figure in it, like a ghost of me, right? So there is video that is of women in my parents' ancestral village, of older women, grandmas, who, so it's a kind of fabulation in some way. These are grandmas who I imagine their mothers and grandmothers were in the Women's War, images of young women, dancing, and then also juxtaposed with or happening in proximity to images from Nollywood pieces, because I'm always interested in Nollywood as, yes, problematic in the ways it might try to assume some kind of proximity to US industry or Hollywood industry, movie industry, but I'm interested in how it was an attempt to start to build narratives that reflect how Nigerian people might be thinking about Nigerian people and conditions. So the video is interspersed with both what's actually happening, these women dancers, and then these kind of fabulations, and these women in kind of distress in Nollywood films. And then within the piece, there is also a devised raffia sculpture, which kind of is is a kind of mimicking of a masquerade and thinking about a kind of ancestral figure or a practice of a kind of living, an object that isn't dematerialized, right? It's a living thing, or I like to think of it sometimes as an object that might be like almost like a time travel, a portal through time, right? Because often, people are supposed to go into these spaces and access a kind of ancestral kind of voice. So all of these things, and then of course there's my body inside of it. So I guess that's pretty much it, Thanks.
Thanks, all three of you. It honestly hadn't occurred to me, probably because I'm so exhausted, when we came up with the idea to gather here today, that all three of you are dealing with duration or performance in these works. So I guess I want to ask first about what about that format, the format of the performative, or Okwui, obviously you're a performer, but even in the way you've incorporated time and duration into the installation that you've made out of the performance is all about duration. So why that format in order to address the different kinds of memorials in a way that you're making?
Are you?
I'm curious for all.
I just spoke. I'll address it.
Yeah.
I was also thinking a lot about that as Okwui was speaking, actually, what duration gives you access to. And for me, I've learned over the years, I've often worked with interviews in my work, and I think that it takes a lot of time for people to feel relaxed in front of a camera if they're not professionals and if they don't spend time being interviewed very often. And I'm very interested in what happens when you just take the pressure of time away from an interview and allow people whatever space it is that they need to unfold themselves as they choose to unfold themselves. So the way my interviews always work is they end when the person who is being interviewed says they've had enough, or they have to go pick up their child from school, or they don't feel like sharing anymore. And so this piece has embedded within it 12 hours of interviews. This kind of thing drives the galleries that I work with crazy. The last piece had 20 hours of interviews in it. And I think it also has to do with a kind of sense of my own kind of, I don't believe that I would be an adequate editor of these interviews. I don't throw anything out. I don't believe that I have an intimate enough relationship to all of the experience that's embedded in these interviews to just whip through them and say, well, that's not interesting, that's repetitive. I'm also interested in how a lot of the stuff that gets thrown out of interviews can actually be really rich and telling. I'm very interested in repetition. I'm very interested in when people meander or stop or leave a long pause. And I think usually in more professional formats, all of that stuff would be considered losable and it would just be cut out. But I'm also interested in the way the attention economy socializes us increasingly as our lives are more and more digital, and obviously that has been accelerated by the pandemic, conditions us to pay very little attention to many things all the time. And when you're dealing with familiar matter or familiar people, it may be enough to read a tweet or a quick post or to have a quick chat in order to really connect with a person and feel a person. But I think when it comes to trying to do justice to very complex stories that haven't received much grace or dignity or visibility, there's something almost violent about then trying to intervene and be the deciding subject who gets to choose what stays in and what goes out. You'll see, I didn't mention this earlier because I kind of felt like I was taking too much time to speak, but the piece also has a second part, and the second part is fictional. And the same 10 individuals whose interviews I consider to be the core of the work and the treasure of the work come on stage in a fictional piece, which is a scripted piece, which is narrated by a young boy, and they form a Greek chorus. A Greek chorus has historically been a conscience, a presence which annotates and writes marginal notes next to a voice which is positioned more centrally. So this community of 10 activists returns as a kind of conscience or a collective presence in the work. And I think that I'd like to say that it also has to do, I think, with the lesson I've learned as a white woman. I'm on a long journey to unlearn my white feminism. You know, I mean, someone like me discovered feminism through the most limited forms of feminism, talking about, you know, the late 80s in South Africa, where apartheid was still alive and kicking. And I found my way into a feminism which felt radical and important to me at that very nascent moment in my life, and have spent the decades that followed trying to unwrap that white feminism and understand its relationship to other feminisms and other experiences of being a woman or being female identified or being queer in the world. And I think that words that stay with me are the words of my friend Grada Kilomba, who is an artist and a theater maker and a storyteller and a writer. And Grada once said something to me which I've held deep in my heart. She said that privilege is impatient. Privilege imagines that it can change things overnight, and it imagines that it can make a difference quickly. And if you are the subject of oppression, if your family, generations before you, have been subject to oppression, I think by necessity, one develops a sense of patience that grows out of an understanding of how slowly things change, even with the best of intention and even with the most political of wills. And so I'm trying to learn to be more patient as a human being and as an artist. And I think that sometimes for me that means creating structures which involve a lot of listening and just allowing myself to learn my way into experiences of the world which are very removed from my own way of being in the world. So maybe that's a start, the question of duration. Yeah.
You go. Hello. Oh, just, for the sake of it, I'll answer differently. I mean, because there's so many things to follow up on, but I feel like there's another path, potentially. I have been working with live art and questions of a lifetime and performance, collectivity, collaboration, for as long as I've let myself be an artist. And I think for me, in this work in particular, one of the things that I'm trying to utilize, like the liveness, because Help the Dead was alive, and I actually think that when we were making this piece, we were also hoping to one day be able to do that, is that the indeterminacy of the live moment. Certainly the audience, with Help the Dead, it was very much, it's in the round, there's a limited capacity for the audience, trying to create an intimacy and a certain accountability in the room, actually, where we're all looking towards each other. But in oops, I got off track. But really, yeah, I guess I wanted to say, like, this indeterminacy, and I'm trying to use also the liveness to allow for kind of the humor and the trauma to coexist. And in writing, these are the first works that I've fully scripted for many years, having worked with improvisation, which is I just have to laugh. It's difficult, and has its own set of conditions that I was very interested in terms of institutional questions. and what is aliveness within institutions was the question I was asking for a long time. But in this case, I've scripted them, and I really tried very hard to write in a way that I didn't tell you what was funny or tell you what was sad. You know, it's what is going to kick somebody off in one direction or another. And I feel like the liveness and the embodiment, when that can be delivered, lets you really have your own interaction with the material. That's what it was crucial for me to work with a performer and to put these works, these questions within the realm of aliveness.
I think, you know, to sort of echo what everyone is saying, I feel there's some usefulness in making time for something to degrade, for a space for what you haven't been able to predict to sort of bloom, right? It's just like, I feel like duration is kind of like the fungi, the mycorrhizal networks, you know, between trees, like the time it takes for the roots and those networks to come together and understand how to communicate. Like there are just like types of potential that happen when you allow things to be, you know, and also, of course, there's also the element of the time it takes to make change, to finally be seen. There's a kind of insistence, you know, so I think that when we look at what was happening with Black Lives Matter, we look at the civil rights movement in this country, we look at post-colonial movements in other countries. In 1929, these women were, you know, fighting to be heard and seen by the colonial project, and some people would say they are a precursor to the post-colonial movements that were really in full force in the 1950s and 1960s in Africa. So just think about that, right? 29 to so I'm really interested too in duration as sort of strategy. Yeah.
Boom.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Only if you want to.
You guys are all so amazing. I am feeling the absence of Teresa Margolles, who I think is another artist who absolutely is speaking with you guys. And again, this question of language and what gets narrated and told and gets to participate in these conversations and what does not in a state where we are majority Spanish speaking. But especially when Okwui was talking about the raffia and this sort of transference that happened from a place of need during COVID, but that materiality as a language that calls back to a lost past. And I think about it a lot in relationship to the wig in Teresa's piece, which also deals with a community of sex workers who made a refugee center along the border. And the wig is something that, because this community has so few resources, when a sex worker is murdered, the wig gets sold then and resold, and it becomes this symbol of the female ideal of an economics of self, persistence. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, Okwui, about the presence of the raffia as this like reaching back, thinking about all of you in your different formats, this like materiality of narrating memorial or lost history.
Yeah, I mean, for me too, for me too, it's like I have so much fabulation in the work, right? It's a hope. You know, there was I have a performance. I did a performance for the last couple of days, and the song itself is like this attempt to find a bridge to those women that I will never know and that are lost to me, not just because of the Middle Passage that, you know, identifies me as African American, but also because of the colonial project that, you know, is a rupture from past traditions and memory and language. But one thing that I do know in my research is that these sort of masquerades, these sculptures, these objects, right, you know, at some point when they're taken by or stolen by the West and put in museums, right, they just become objects divorced from, you know, their function, their action. And there is a space in Igbo culture where there's a sense that the ancestors, they don't necessarily die, right? They're kind of alongside you. And there are ways in which you can go to them to seek some information, some counsel, but you also have to feed them, you know what I mean? So in some ways, like, so that they don't die a second death, you have to, attend to them, attend to that space. And this raffia, these masquerades, are in effect some way to attend to that, to move through that, to acknowledge the spectrum of liveliness or deathliness, right? Like that those things are alongside each other, and in some way, in some conversation, collision. But that raffia sculpture, and I like thinking about the wig, in that sense of like it's sort of passed around, right? Like, there's a sense of somehow it holds her, but is it possible that her spirit or is there some kind of strength, some information she can give to the next person who puts this wig on them, right? Whether it's to, I don't know, because part of me wants to think maybe, and this is also a little bit of the fabulous, like she comes in and finds a way to like help them find a path around some of the people that will destroy them, or find a way over the border to safety. You know what I mean? That's kind of where I would like to go with it. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, somebody else.
You want to add anything? Do you have something to add? Or should I ask another question?
Go ahead, yeah.
Well, I'm just struck by the conversation. So much discussion around liveness, as Every puts it, the living object, as Okwui put it, duration performance that Connie asked about. And there's a way in which when I experience your works, it's really charged for me and very emotional. I've really felt that the last day. But also, it's very striking that there is so much joy in the work too. There's, acute moments of humor. There's a lot of, drive to push against some of those darker subjects that are in the work, the reality of women being murdered, the intensity of grief and death, which is just a part of life. And I just thought, each of you could maybe talk a little bit about that. There's singing, there's movement, there's the body, and some humor in all cases. And I think that's really striking if we talk about what might be a contemporary memorial, how all of your practices are offering just a different perspective into what that even means, and why we need those memorials today, but how they can operate differently than perhaps the more expected memorialization of things. So, to no one in particular, if that's something that feels like you want to respond to.
I'll start and maybe not offer a whole paragraph, but maybe we can start to talk. Is that okay? One of the things that came up in that question for me was to think, and in the quote that I had offered earlier, I don't know if it's too much if I say it again, but it's, I was interested when I first started to really kind of research and learn into this field myself, the questions of this kind of non-binary nature of life and death. Because in general, if you lose someone, it's quite definitive. But it's really, life and spirituality and religion, and what happens after death is maybe the most abstract thing that I've ever thought about in a lifetime of abstraction. So like this non-binary nature became interesting. Of course, the ancestors and the objects, the materiality, the voice, the movement, all of the manners in which we make efforts to keep spirit alive. So I'll just throw that out there, because that's kind of one of the things that I was thinking that also relates to the liveness that we are speaking of in relationship to this memorializing.
I think I'm interested in the way things slip into and out of each other. And one thing which I took very seriously when I started to speak to various individuals in the sweat community was that the worst thing that I could produce was poverty porn. There's a lot of poverty porn in the art world. It does very well on the art market. And I think, we see a lot of artists stepping very quickly into situations which are not theirs and taking a quick snap or turning it into a series of spectacular photographs simply because the subjects in the photographs are people who have not been seen by the people who are buying and looking at the images. And I suppose I was very conscious of not wanting to create poverty porn. Not only was I conscious of it, I was told bluntly and instructed that this was not going to be poverty porn. And, all of the individuals who are featured in the piece are people who are empowered by their own activism and by their community. I think that, again, what's interesting here is the kind of binary of individual and community gets very broken down in a community like this, where it's very much about shared experience and looking after each other and not just about individual biographies. And I realized that one of my tasks was to make sure that I conducted the interviews in such a way that there was space for some of the darkness and some of the absolute horror of what it is to spend years putting your body in danger, not only in relation to the people buying your services, but also in relationship to the sort of forces that are supposed to protect you, government and the police. And so there's a lot of darkness in the storytelling in the interviews, but there are also really, really funny anecdotes. And we all felt that it was incredibly important to hold space not only for those aspects of life which are sort of difficult and intense and dark and violent, but also to acknowledge favorite clients, or there are one amazing woman, Duduzile Dlamini, who's an award-winning activist who travels all over the world in dialogue with other sex work communities. She mostly sells her services to very affluent white Jewish men in Cape Town's richest suburb, and she tells hilarious stories about how the wife disappears into another room while she's around and then comes out to pay her at the end. And there are other stories about exchange of groceries or school fees as opposed to, and it was important for us to make sure that people were present in a round and in a full way, because no matter how much you're suffering or prospering in life, those two experiences of intensity, loss and mourning and gain and joy, these things are all closely connected to each other. In fact, we were speaking, Avery and I, about how those people who do the work of bringing people into the world, birth doulas, often also are performing services of helping people to transition into death. And I think that's incredibly interesting because we come back to this idea of transition. I also, for me, TLDR is a story about white savior behavior. And in that sense, you will see that unexpectedly there are several prominent Hollywood actresses who are involuntarily incorporated into the piece. The piece was shot, it was not planned, but it was shot at the very moment that the whole Harvey Weinstein and Me Too thing was breaking. The last day of our shoot was the day that the story came out. And we were very conscious. We had been workshopping this piece and preparing for the shoot. We were very conscious of the ways in which a handful of stories of individuals who were very prominent, very comfortable in lives, very visible, were all of a sudden receiving a huge amount of attention. And I certainly don't want to imply, any act of sexual violation or sexual violence is an awful thing. But I think that many of us became very aware very fast of how all of the attention that was being channeled towards these very prominent incidents of sexual violence meant that very little thinking was being done around, experiences of violence among people who can't protect themselves as easily, either legally or monetarily or in other ways from that violence, who can't go to the press, who can't go to an expensive lawyer. And so I am not quite sure, because I think we're all a little tired here today. I feel like I've lost my track of thought, but I'm always interested in the way that things which feel like the opposite of each other appear within each other and sort of underlie each other and are present to each other.
Yeah. Yes. It made me think of this. I thought of this quote that was sent to me by Ralph Lemon, who is a dear heart mentor, love, incredible artist. And in responding to Anne Ellegood's question too, around, the shape of the memorial that we're thinking of, or, is there a space for joy, or how are we constructing it in a way that may not necessarily be, what, I don't know, like standard Western practices of what it means to consider death, right, as this sort of end, this sepulchral kind of space that no one emerges from, or that you fall into. Anyway, so this is from a scholar, Jasmine Johnson. I pulled out my glasses. I do this all the time. I have glasses.
Just don't use them.
I know. And I'm squinting. I'm like, gosh, this could be so much easier. So, Black vernacular dance traditions, however, are not joyful despite brown feelings. They are buoyant because of them. Black people dancing, and ellipse, then Black people dancing, in other words, is not antipodal to sorrow. It is its child. So I think, to me, that speaks to also when I think of maybe certain West African or Igbo ways of moving with death, of being in the dance of it, right? The sort of body vibration that you allow yourself to engage. Okay.
I'll just jump in real quick again, because, I should have to be real quick. Why do I have to be real quick? All these paragraph different temporalities. I just wanted to say I haven't used the word queer yet, but usually it's something that is often brought up by me and others in relationship to my projects, and but it's important that when I started doing this, important to me when I started doing this work, that it was deeply rooted in the queer histories that I've been a student of and that are my legacies. So one of these questions of memorializing and joy and grief, we can't have the panel without speaking of the activists and the AIDS activist efforts, and that really informed this the tone of the work that I was producing, the collaboration and the need for it to be in community, and a whole bunch of other things. But it's a deep root there that I think influences my work and others.
And I also wanted to add too, actually, just the sense of community and collaboration is also in my work. I mean, my partner, Peter Bourne, is not here. He's super instrumental in developing the design of the pieces with me. We also have been doing these sort of collective improvisational choruses with artists where we actually open up the space over 6 hours, 4 hours for people to shape and add content, lyrics, their bodies, and slow walk together. So I'm also really interested, again, in all of the ways that in some ways it's a memorial because we're asking people to delve into their memories and think. We address questions: what do you imagine happens when you die? What do you carry, and how in turn does that carry you? And so this is what they bring into the space and vibrate with in the space. And there are, incredible lyrics that happen, and sometimes just moans. And so I wanted to speak about that in the sense of what I feel like is the collaborative spirit that is, essential, I think, to like a feminist, queer, anti-colonial, anti-white supremacist practice.
And maybe I'll take the opportunity, because I think it may not be it may not be obvious to everyone who experiences my piece. And I'm thinking, listening to the two of you talking, that the piece, the projected piece, which is in the second room, not the interview room, it ends with a long scene of protest. And I think to people who are not South African or of the African continent, it might not be clear that this is a scene of protest, because it is so joyous. It really feels more like celebration as we might understand it. There's a lot of singing and dancing and ululating, and it feels intensely joyous. And it's a tradition that has been passed down through generations of South Africans, and these are actually songs that were designed in protest of apartheid, and which have survived that era and continue to be used and retooled and reshaped. And it was so interesting to me how at the end of the shoot, which was my first very scripted piece, I've never written a script before. It's also the second part of a trilogy, so there's lots of overlap. It was interesting to me that what happened as we were approaching the end of the shoot, and everybody who was on set knew that we were approaching the end of the shoot, was I think that everybody who was on set thought that I had said cut, and I hadn't. And the structure, my very kind of tight, composed structure, all of a sudden broke down. And there was this moment of celebration and protest that happened for 20 minutes. And I sort of looked at the people who were on camera and I said, carry on rolling. It was just so beautiful and so joyous and so spontaneous, and had absolutely nothing to do with my direction. It was free of my direction. And when it came to editing the piece and making final decisions about what would stay in, it just felt like there was something interesting and important about that kind of claiming of the format. It was an act of love. It felt like an act of love to have collaborated within a format which I had pretty much devised, but to then break it down and allow it to disintegrate and to return to a kind of communal celebration and protest which was of the community rather than being brought to it from the outside. So somehow that feels relevant.
Can I just say something too, just in response to that? I know you guys have some questions, but I just, that when you call it an act of love, right? There are so many people who are so resistant to the idea of losing control, not being in control, not possessing something, not owning something. And to think that like letting go of ownership of an idea, of a space, of a place, is actually a potentially liberating force, you know? Like I think James Baldwin talked about how, you know, the problem of our time is going to be borders, right? And not recognizing that they are obsolete. And of course we know that global, you know, multinational corporations are already existing in a borderless economies. But anyway, but I think that there is something to speak about of, you know, setting up a prompt, asking for something, taking time, and at some point letting go of what you thought, of what you meant, and the act of love that is the generosity of the contributions of you know, letting your collaborators be collaborators. I think that's really beautiful. So
and I think
it's
you
very
guys,
odd.
I'm going to jump in. Yeah. I think you guys all have this. I'm struck by this very graceful, loving approach to narrative and narrativity. This, like, there's a humility in it. There's what Okwui was saying, this taking up of fables, or this reclaiming of queer space or queer histories, or when you're talking about non-Western histories, like what the body even means and what representation means as an act of communication and transference completely. But I was wondering if you guys would speak a little bit about that. Because their performative narration is something that plays a central role in all of your works.
I did just speak.
Yeah.
Nobody's counting.
No, I know. I just think, yeah, no.
You're going there.
No, I'm just thinking.
Yeah, me too, I'm thinking.
Can you just, I'm a little kind of tired. Can you just say that again?
I just think,
Let's
I mean,
open it to
because
the
I just
floor.
think multiple bodies, like, is it possible I've just been thinking about how, in some sense, we're going to think of ourselves, we're going to have to think of ourselves as a multiplicity, right? You know, there isn't a single body that can exist on its own. And so how to even think about liberation as a space of allowing other bodies to also claim some purchase on the site of your body. And so I think, I mean, it's also complicated, right? As African American Black women, like so many of us have constantly tried to make space, educate, exercise patience, have hope for the souls of white folks. But what is it, you know, what is the next step in human evolution, but to somehow recognize that we are multiple. And so in my piece, of course, there are these bodies that are in constant, like no one body takes up all of the space, right? So there's this they're constantly in some way in proximity to each other, next to each other, sometimes disappearing. Anyway.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's what happened in my first one.
Her question is too smart. I think she has to dumb it down for us a bit.
No, I got up there with some energy and then boom.
We are really tired, but it's good. It's all good.
Okay, but I'll come back. It was oh, okay.
Everyone wants
you
to
know, now what do we have here? You know, is it worth it? But there was, for me, as I mentioned, it's the first time I'd really scripted something, and I really needed to come down to this this incredible specificity that I thought the details of the corpse and the care of the corpse and how that allows us to access and actually have a very wide imagination. You know, so in this case, the more specific, the more grounded, the more material, I actually felt like the more expansive it became rather than some generalities. And then in terms of the performative narration of the question, I would say that for me, the character is a little bit, is it this or that? You know, somebody had given me the feedback of saying, is this, that the whole time they were watching the piece, is this person a death doula or are they a performer? Are they a death doula or are they a performer? You know, and I think that's because the character is yeah, I used this term earlier, but more than one thing. And specifically in the kind of experience that they are relaying, we wonder if someone of this age, you know, could have such experience. And that was a decision I made to say, to have like this kind of millennial younger figure be carrying this, be a younger body, be invested in the end of life, just to provide a little bit of tension there. But
I think I
Candice,
came round to this by listening to others. I mean, I feel like all narrative is performed, and I think that's maybe why I wasn't able to answer immediately. I feel like even when we're in conversation with each other or telling each other stories in domestic or private spaces, we're performing those narratives, whether we're conscious of them or not. And I've always been interested in how narratives can be heightened through working process, whether it's through choreography or through workshopping a script, or I kind of imagine that you spend time with your performer and it shifted, and at the same time in a kind of polyvocality or multivocality. So I wrote the script for the fictional piece, but then we worked through it with the young child, a 12-year-old who tells the story. We worked through it with him and his mother, and they helped me to layer it with language that would be comfortable for him to use and articulate. And then we spent 3 weeks taking the script apart, sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, with the broader community and reading through it and deciding how we would put choreography to each fragment of the script. And so by the time that script sort of resonates in the piece, it's carrying traces of different voices, and it's been intervened in and interrupted. And I'm very interested in interruption and overlapping as ways of making meaning. I enjoy conversations where everybody's trying to speak at the same time, because sometimes it's more interesting than just listening to one person sound off for long periods of time. So, yeah.
Oh my God, we could just, how much time does everyone have? We could just stay here all night. And I know we're already over time, but I do want to, if people want to, just offer a couple of questions from the audience, because you're gathered, and it would be a shame not to. So Oscar, do you want to handle the mic for that? We'll just do 2 questions.
Oh, thanks for staying with us.
Yeah, 2 questions. Back here.
We have a question about the chorus, but before I get to that, I just want to add my voice to the celebratory chorus of this day, which is just to say this is an absolutely remarkable exhibition project, and I thank you for it. Some of the artists, and curators, the installation designers, the communication coordinators, the publication designers. As a fellow curator, you wait for moments like this, exhibitions that just maintain and renew your belief in contemporary art and galleries, and therefore maintain your belief in the world. So cheers to you, phenomenal. Sorry, Anne's been emotionally charged all day. My question is the chorus, and it first started to emerge, Candice, in an early remark you made, or actually near the end of your presentation, where you referred to the interview room as an archive of the future. And I was happy to later hear you speak to the accompanying adjoining piece and the protest songs as being very joyous. And I also think of that as an archive of the future, or a future archive. And so that's my question to you, of course. You spoke about kind of the call response structure of your piece as chorus, verse, which I think is really beautiful as you're trying to queer death. And you reminded us to think not just of our individual losses of grief and death, but collective, global experiences of death, whether it be through economic exploitation, species extinction, ad infinitum. And then, of course, Okwui, the chorus. We learned so much about the chorus through your years of work, including the Dance Space project dedicated to utterances from the chorus, where Saidiya Hartman says that the chorus bears all of it for us, but it's also the incubator of possibility. So, given the chorus that is this exhibition project, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more to the chorus.
That was a sneaky way.
Yeah, we're done.
So interesting. You were like, okay, got all 3 of you. You just did it.
Last word was yours.
She did it. Yeah, exactly.
Boom. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was great. We take that.
I'm taking it in.
Taking it.
Yeah.
But yes, also.
I would like to answer because you've reminded me of something important, which I could spend a lot more time speaking about this work, and I'm grateful to you for noticing that the piece is also, the fictional part of the work also does some work of archiving. So I think it's important to mention that all of the protest slogans that appear on protest signs in the piece are drawn from decades of sex work advocacy, and we put those together collectively, and the idea was that within the fictional piece there would be space for archiving the strategies and the experience of protest that had evolved within this community over time. And so the t-shirts which the activists wear are sweat t-shirts, the masks, the skull mask which they wear are masks that they use also in public protest. their Say Her Name campaign, which is about remembering and keeping alive slain sex workers. You'll see that there are in the piece white protest signs which mention the names of sex workers who've been killed or died violently, and those come from Sweat's practice, and so those two are visually archived in the piece. And so wherever we could in the making of the fictional piece, there was an attempt to sort of sneak in all of these props of activism and strategies of activism, and to have them almost be kind of stored in the work. And you'll see in the credits at the end of the work, there's a list of which of these objects and costumes relate back to Sweat practice and Sweat reality. So thank you for, creating space for me to remember to mention that.
One more. Unless we're all like way too tired.
I have one more. No one else
Connie gets
does.
the last word.
And thank you, I don't know you, but thank you for the exhibitionist chorus idea, which I'm going to hold on to. That's really beautiful. And maybe this is a way to kind of wind up, which is to ask, since all of you, well, I mean, Okwui and Candice have shown these works in other contexts before. I mean, Okwui in Grief and Grievance. Candice, I know you've shown it at least once that I know of, but it's a second chapter of a series, so in some ways the content has kind of been in other contexts. So I'm wondering what, if anything, at this point, after the few days that we've all been together, and you've been thinking about the show now for many months with us, years, COVID, how the meaning of the work changes for you at all in the context of an all-woman or woman and woman-identified exhibition, if it does, or thoughts you have about that? Or just the context of this show, I guess.
It's nice not to have to explain everything. I mean, in this context, indeed, to have a community of shared understanding where not everyone understands everything, but where there's a little more shared territory. It's a little, it's a little less work, in a way.
I could say for me, it's been important that it's that the show is woman identified, and that there's self-determination allowed in that, and that is the the largest context for the piece, and because one of the primary concerns, is really also being able to think about this about self-determination, and I think that's a lot of our projects come at that from so many different angles. So I would say it holds the work.
Yeah, I guess I will also just say that sense of the chorus is very powerful here, and I think because I'm right next to Teresa Margolis, and I had time to be in the courtyard as I was rehearsing my piece, there's an image of one of the women looking up to the sky, right? Like in almost like there's a sense of hope, right? And I was looking up into the sky as a sense of like a desire to reach or connect, which also could be hope, but there's a little despair. And so I feel like I borrowed something from that, and that's the chorus to me, to continue, so the piece is evolving, but my body in relationship to it can continue to, to continue to vibrate with whatever, with all of the other offerings and gifts.
In your performance, Okwui, that I saw yesterday, there's this very devastating moment where it starts out very ambiguously, but then you actually look at everyone around you, and it's just so striking, this bravery of looking and being seen. And I feel like that, to to be in collectivity with other female identified artists or dedicated histories of feminism, you know, like as a woman, or these stories that Candice, you're telling in your piece, looking at people and being seen can be such a violent space for women around the world. But that's a really interesting part of it.
People, but
Yeah,
like they're looking at us, but then we're looking back.
Yeah.
Right? So to keep the loop going. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to our artists. Woo, woo, woo!